Right now, in the spring of 2026, something is unfolding on the battlefields of Ukraine that may ultimately determine how this war ends, and it is happening largely out of sight, beneath the smoke, beneath the drone footage, beneath the spectacle that most of the world is still focused on, while attention remains fixed on missile strikes, on aerial interceptions, on dramatic footage of explosions captured from above. A quieter transformation has already crossed a critical threshold on the ground. It is not loud, it does not announce itself, but it is persistent, methodical, and increasingly decisive. It does not sleep, it does not fear, it does not require rest, and it does not draw from the same pool of human limits that have defined every war up until now. And perhaps most importantly, it is scaling at a rate that very few outside Ukraine's command structure fully anticipated. In March of 2026, that transformation produced a number that, on its surface, sounds simple, but in reality represents something far more consequential: 10,000 missions in 30 days. 10,000. That is not just a statistic to be noted and moved past, it is a signal that the tempo of ground operations has entered an entirely different category. To put that into perspective, that level of sustained, coordinated activity is something many conventional militaries would struggle to achieve over a much longer operational cycle. And here it is being delivered in a single month, continuously, without the natural slowdowns imposed by fatigue, by rotation, by human endurance. That translates to more than 300 separate ground operations every single day, running regardless of weather, regardless of time, regardless of the physical constraints that traditionally shape how armies move and fight. And it is at precisely this point that the underlying equation of the war begins to shift. For 4 years, the Russian strategy has rested on a relatively straightforward premise: that scale and manpower can compensate for losses, that sustained pressure can gradually exhaust the opponent, and that over time, sheer numbers will prevail. It is a strategy rooted in attrition, in the belief that the side capable of committing more people for longer will eventually dominate the battlefield. Under that assumption, Ukraine's limitations in manpower present a structural vulnerability, one that Russia has attempted to exploit repeatedly. But what happens when that assumption begins to lose its reliability? What happens when a growing portion of battlefield activity is no longer constrained by the availability, endurance, or survivability of human soldiers? This is where Ukraine's evolving use of unmanned ground vehicles, UGVs, begins to alter not just tactics, but the underlying logic of the conflict itself. This is the rampart. To understand the scale of what is happening, it is necessary to look not just at a single number, but at the trajectory behind it. In November of 2025, Ukraine's UGV operations accounted for approximately 2,800 missions in 1 month. At the time, this was already seen as a meaningful step forward, evidence that ground robotics had moved beyond experimental deployment into something operationally relevant. December saw that number increase sharply, nearly doubling. January added further volume, pushing the total higher still. February continued the trend, climbing into the range of over 8,000 missions. And then March delivered 10,000. This is not a steady, linear increase. It is acceleration. And acceleration in military systems tends to produce effects that are disproportionate to the incremental changes that precede it. Each increase is not simply an addition, it compounds the overall tempo, compresses reaction times, and places additional strain on any opposing system that is still operating within more traditional constraints. But raw numbers alone do not capture the full extent of the transformation. Equally important is how widely these systems have been integrated across Ukraine's forces. What began as a limited capability used by a relatively small number of units has expanded rapidly. By late 2025, dozens of units were experimenting with or deploying UGVs. By early 2026, that number had grown significantly, spreading across medical units, assault formations, and air assault brigades. This kind of distribution is not incidental. It indicates that the technology is no longer confined to niche roles. Instead, it is becoming embedded in the structure of operations, supporting logistics, evacuation, reconnaissance, and increasingly, direct engagement. When a capability reaches this level of adoption across different branches with different missions, it begins to function less like a tool and more like a foundational layer within the system itself. The origins of this shift are rooted in necessity. By late 2024, the battlefield environment had evolved in a way that made traditional logistics increasingly hazardous. The widespread use of FPV drones meant that any movement, particularly movement involving vehicles or groups of soldiers, could be detected and targeted with increasing precision. Supply routes that had once been viable became high-risk corridors. Trucks were destroyed. Personnel moving on foot were exposed. The simple act of transporting ammunition, food, or medical supplies became one of the most dangerous aspects of frontline operations. In that context, the introduction of small, low-profile unmanned vehicles offered a practical alternative. These early UGVs were not designed as weapons. They were designed to move things quietly, remotely, and with a lower risk profile than human carriers. Consider what a typical supply mission looks like under these conditions. It does not begin with movement. It begins with observation. Operators monitor drone patterns, identify gaps in surveillance, assess terrain, and select routes that minimize exposure. Timing becomes critical. When the window opens, the UGV moves slowly, deliberately, often hugging terrain to reduce visibility. It carries a load that might otherwise require multiple soldiers to transport, and it does so without drawing the same level of attention. There is no engine noise comparable to a truck, no visible formation of troops, no obvious signature that can be easily tracked. The journey may take longer, but the probability of completion is significantly higher, and over time, as these missions accumulate, the effect becomes substantial. By late 2025, a large majority of supplies reaching certain high-intensity sectors were being delivered in this manner, effectively shifting the logistical backbone of those operations. From logistics, the transition to medical evacuation followed naturally. The same characteristics that made UGVs effective at delivering supplies low visibility, remote operation, reduced risk to personnel, also made them suitable for extracting wounded soldiers from exposed areas. In practice, this means that individuals who might otherwise remain in place due to the danger of evacuation can be moved with less risk to additional personnel. Over the course of a single day, multiple evacuation missions can be conducted, covering distances that would be extremely difficult for human teams to sustain under constant threat. This is not merely a marginal improvement. It represents an expansion of what is operationally feasible, allowing units to recover personnel under conditions that would previously have been prohibitive. The most significant shift, however, occurs when these platforms move beyond support roles and into direct engagement. Mounting weapons on UGVs introduces a different dynamic. It creates a system that can approach, engage, and withdraw without exposing a human operator to immediate danger. From a technical perspective, this is an extension of existing remote systems. From a psychological and tactical perspective, it alters how engagements are perceived and conducted. For a soldier encountering such a system, the interaction is fundamentally different. There is no visible opponent in the traditional sense, no immediate feedback loop based on human behavior. The system does not hesitate, does not react to intimidation, and does not experience fear. It performs a defined function and continues until that function is complete or the system is disabled. This shift is further amplified when considering the use of UGVs for delivering explosive payloads into fortified or collapsed structures. Instead of committing personnel to clear confined spaces under uncertain conditions, a remotely operated platform can be sent in with a specific objective. The outcome is determined by the payload rather than by prolonged close-quarters engagement. In operational terms, this reduces both the time and the human cost associated with such actions. Each instance where a machine performs this role represents a substitution, a direct replacement of a high-risk human task with a lower-risk mechanical one. At a broader level, these developments intersect with a central challenge facing Ukraine: manpower constraints. Sustaining a prolonged conflict places continuous demands on personnel, both in terms of numbers and endurance. Russia's larger population provides a degree of resilience in this regard, allowing it to absorb losses and continue fielding forces. However, if a portion of battlefield functions can be reliably transferred to machines, the relationship between manpower and operational capacity begins to change. Reports indicating a measurable reduction in casualties associated with increased UGV usage suggest that this is not purely theoretical. If fewer personnel are required to achieve the same objectives, then the pressure exerted by attrition decreases accordingly. This leads to a critical point in the strategic calculus. Attrition-based strategies depend on both sides drawing from comparable pools of resources, primarily human. If one side begins to offset its requirements through non-human systems, the symmetry breaks down. The rate at which losses translate into reduced capability becomes uneven. Over time, this can erode the effectiveness of strategies that rely on sustained pressure and gradual depletion. It does not eliminate the importance of manpower, but it alters its role within the overall system. Looking ahead, the trajectory suggests continued expansion. Production of UGVs within Ukraine has increased, with multiple entities contributing to development and manufacturing. As more units enter service, the aggregate capacity grows, and with it, the potential to assume additional roles. The question then becomes not whether these systems will continue to be used, but how far their integration will extend. If mission counts continue to rise, reaching levels beyond 10,000 per month, and if deployment expands across more sectors, the cumulative effect could reshape the operational landscape in ways that are still emerging. From the Russian perspective, countermeasures are already being developed, including efforts to detect and neutralize these systems. However, the characteristics that make UGVs effective, small size, low profile, adaptability, also make them challenging targets. Unlike larger platforms, they can be dispersed, concealed, and replaced with relative ease. This creates a dynamic in which defensive measures must account for a growing number of low-signature systems operating across varied terrain. Ultimately, the significance of this development lies not in any single mission or capability, but in the pattern that is forming. A system that operates continuously, scales rapidly, and reduces reliance on human presence introduces a different set of constraints and possibilities. It does not replace all aspects of warfare, but it modifies key components in ways that can accumulate over time. The outcome is not determined instantly. Rather, it emerges through sustained interaction between opposing systems, each adapting to the other. What is clear is that the parameters of the conflict are no longer static. The introduction and expansion of UGV operations represent an ongoing shift, one that intersects with logistics, combat, and strategy simultaneously. Whether this shift proves decisive will depend on how it continues to evolve and how effectively each side responds. But the direction of change is already visible. 10,000 missions in 30 days is not an endpoint. It is an indicator of momentum, and momentum, once established at this scale, is not easily reversed. This is the rampart.